My name is Leo, and my current profession is a lie. By day, I am the operator of Professor Alistair's Electricum Phantasma, a marvel of the modern age housed in a dusty canvas tent. For a dime, I show slack-jawed farmers the bones in their own hands using the crackling, ozone-scented magic of Roentgen's rays. The traveling carnival smells of popcorn manure and the gasoline that fuels our generator, a constant thrum beneath the floorboards. But the air inside the tent is different. It's cold. When the Crookes tube ignites with its ghostly green light, a deep, unnatural chill bleeds into the space, and the hum of the induction coil sounds less like science and more like a predator's purr. The patrons emerge pale and giddy, but I see a flicker of vacancy in their eyes, a brief, smooth emptiness where a moment before there was a person. The apparatus occupies the tent's center, on a platform constructed from planks salvaged from a demolished grain elevator. The Crookes tube itself is a masterwork of German engineering, manufactured by Siemens and Halske in 1904, a pear-shaped vessel of hand-blown glass evacuated to near-perfect vacuum. Within its crystalline body, a cathode disc of hammered aluminum faces an anode of platinum wire. When the Ruhmkorff induction coil delivers its charge, 15,000 volts pulsing through copper windings wrapped in gutta percha. Insulation. Electrons tear free from the cathode and accelerate toward the anode, and where they strike the glass envelope, X-rays bloom into existence like invisible flowers of pure penetration. Professor Alistair does not exist. He is a fabrication I maintain through a painted backdrop, showing a bearded gentleman in academic robes, surrounded by the paraphernalia of Victorian scientific respectability, leather-bound volumes, brass instruments, framed certificates bearing Latin phrases I composed myself. The carnival's proprietor, a man named Hewitt who owns the traveling show and takes 60% of all earnings, believes the professor lends legitimacy to what would otherwise be regarded as dangerous quackery. The farmers who pay their dimes prefer to imagine their flesh rendered transparent by a distinguished man of learning, rather than by Leo Kraftmeyer, 28 years old, formerly employed as a photographic assistant in a Chicago portrait studio, until my employer discovered I had been supplementing my income by selling prints of wealthy clients' wives to collectors of illicit imagery. I had fled Chicago with my equipment and enough money to reach Kansas, where Hewitt's carnival offered employment to anyone who could operate technical apparatus and maintain the illusion of scientific demonstration. The X-ray exhibition attracted customers through novelty and a titillating transgression of bodily privacy. Men paid to see the bones in their hands. Women, chaperoned by husbands or fathers, paid to see the same, though their true interest was often in glimpsing the forbidden architecture of their own bodies, the ivory cage of ribs, and the shadowy suggestion of organs existing beneath propriety's concealment. The tent accommodates 6 patrons per session. They enter through canvas flaps that I secure with leather ties, creating darkness necessary for the fluorescent screen to display its skeletal revelations. The screen itself is a wooden frame, holding a sheet of cardboard coated with barium platinocyanide, a chemical compound that glows pale green when struck by X-rays. I position each patron before the screen, with their hand pressed flat against its surface. Then I retire behind a lead-lined barrier, a sheet of roofing lead I purchased from a Topeka building supply yard, and engage the induction coil. The coil's hum begins as a low vibration that builds in frequency and intensity until it becomes a high-pitched whine felt in the teeth and skull. The Crookes tube ignites with its characteristic green glow, and the air temperature drops immediately, a phenomenon I cannot explain through any principle of electrical physics I have studied. The cold is profound and localized, existing only within the tent's interior, as though the production of X-rays requires heat to be drawn from the surrounding environment and converted into penetrating radiation. As noted in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 12, 1901, localized thermal displacement often accompanies the high-frequency discharge phenomena, its mechanism remaining insufficiently explicated. The patrons see their bones appear on the fluorescent screen, the delicate phalanges of fingers, the broader carpals of the wrist, the parallel struts of radius and ulna, extending into the darkness of the covered forearm. They pressure release. They laugh nervously. Some make jokes about looking like the skeletons in medicine show posters. Others fall silent, confronted by the memento mori of their own mortality, rendered visible through scientific apparatus that strips away the comforting opacity of flesh. I have been operating the Electricum Phantasma for 7 weeks, traveling with Hewitt's Carnival through towns whose names blur together: Hutchinson, Salina, Abilene, Junction City. The routine has become automatic. Set up the tent, connect the induction coil to the generator's electrical supply, check the Crookes tube for cracks or loss of vacuum, prepare the cash box and admission tickets, perform 6 sessions daily at intervals scheduled to maximize attendance, while allowing the equipment to cool between demonstrations. I collect approximately $12 daily, of which Hewitt takes $7.20, leaving me $4.80 to cover my meals, my tent lodging, and the replacement of photographic plates and chemicals I use for a secondary income stream that Hewitt does not know exists. Because I have discovered that the X-ray apparatus does something beyond revealing bones. It captures something else on the glass photographic plates I position behind the fluorescent screen. I began making these exposures as documentation, intending to create promotional materials, showing the skeletal images that drew crowds to the tent. But when I developed the first plates in my makeshift darkroom, a light-tight trunk containing trays of developer, stop bath and fixer, I found images that should not exist. The bones appeared as expected, white shadows on the dark emulsion where X-rays had passed through flesh and struck the silver halide crystals in the photographic gelatin. But surrounding the skeletal forms were other shapes, fainter and less defined, structures that resembled the bones but were not quite aligned with them, as though each patron possessed a second skeleton slightly displaced from the first. These thermal anomaly skeletons showed damage that the visible bones did not exhibit, fractures, erosions, malformations that suggested injury or disease. And in some plates, particularly those exposed during sessions when the tent's cold had been most intense, the thermal anomaly skeletons showed additional structures entirely, appendages and joints that human anatomy does not accommodate. I have accumulated 43 such plates, stored in a locked wooden case beneath my cot in the equipment wagon where I sleep. I have shared them with no one. The images disturb me in ways I cannot articulate, suggesting that the X-ray apparatus penetrates not merely flesh but some deeper layer of existence, revealing aspects of the patrons that they themselves do not know they possess. The thermal anomaly skeletons might be artifacts of the photographic process, double exposures created by vibration or by reflected radiation. But the additional structures, those impossible appendages, defy rational explanation. The Pittsburgh Press, August 12, 1899, reported a peculiar apparition at Carnival. Local witnesses report unnatural forms, hinting at similar inexplicable presentations. And then there is the matter of the patron's eyes. I first noticed it during the 3rd week of operation, in a town called Solomon, where a farmer named Weiss brought his 3 sons to see their bones. The boys were aged perhaps 12, 14, and 16, all wheat-haired and sunburned, excited by the prospect of witnessing modern science. I positioned the youngest before the screen and engaged the apparatus. The Crookes tube ignited. The cold bled into the tent. The boy watched his hand skeleton materialize on the fluorescent surface with appropriate wonder. But when he stepped away from the screen, his expression had changed. The wonder had been replaced by a smooth blankness, a vacancy of affect that suggested his consciousness had been temporarily displaced. The blankness lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then his personality returned, animation flooding back into his features, and he was again a 12-year-old boy excitedly describing what he had seen to his brothers. Yet during those 3 seconds, I had glimpsed something else occupying the space behind his eyes, something that watched me with an intelligence that was not the boy's. Industrial Safety Memorandum 32C. Operators are reminded of potential psychological impacts stemming from prolonged exposure to novel electromagnetic fields. I have observed this phenomenon in approximately 60% of patrons. The percentage has increased over the 7 weeks of operation, from roughly 30% in the early sessions to its current rate. The vacancy appears immediately after exposure to the X-rays, lasts between 2 and 5 seconds, and resolves without the patron showing any awareness that their consciousness had been interrupted. Some patrons exhibit the vacancy only once. Others, particularly those who return for multiple sessions, drawn by morbid fascination to see their bones repeatedly, exhibit it with increasing frequency and duration. This systemic dread of impending breakdown is a pervasive factor. I have attempted to correlate the vacancy with other observable factors. Patrons who show longer exposure times to the X-rays tend to exhibit more frequent vacancies. Patrons who press their hands more firmly against the fluorescent screen, achieving better skeletal definition, tend to show vacancies of longer duration. And patrons whose photographic plates reveal the most pronounced thermal anomaly skeletons and impossible anatomical additions invariably exhibit the vacancy phenomenon, suggesting some connection between the images captured on glass and the temporary displacement of consciousness I witness in living flesh. The carnival has established itself outside a town called Ellsworth for a 3-day engagement. The harvest season has concluded, and farmers have money to spend on entertainments before winter's isolation descends. Hewitt predicts strong attendance. I have prepared accordingly, purchasing additional photographic plates from the town's general store, and mixing fresh batches of developer and fixer using formulas I learned during my Chicago employment. The plates I have already exposed remain locked in their case, a growing archive of images that should not exist, evidence of a phenomenon I do not understand and cannot explain without inviting accusations of fraud or madness. The Pittsburgh Press, July 23, 1904, reported a mechanically compromised fairground attraction evokes public concern. Operators' claims dismissed, indicating public disregard for anomalies. Tonight I performed 6 sessions as scheduled. The tent filled with farmers and their families, townspeople curious about the X-ray marvel advertised on Hewitt's painted banners. I collected their dimes, positioned their hands, engaged the apparatus, watched their bones appear on the fluorescent screen. The cold descended as always. The induction coil's hum resonated in my skull, and in the faces of the patrons, I saw the familiar vacancy appear with increasing frequency. That smooth emptiness that suggested their consciousness had gone somewhere else while something else briefly occupied their flesh. After the final session, I secured the tent and retired to the equipment wagon to develop the evening's plates. The darkroom trunk's interior was lit by a single red lantern that provided illumination without exposing the photographic emulsion. I worked in the chemical-scented darkness, sliding plates through the developer tray and watching the latent images emerge from the milky gelatin like fossils revealed by erosion. As outlined in the Manual of Photographic Processes, 1907 edition, such precise chemical reactions are crucial for documenting transient materialization. The bones appeared first, finger bones, wrist bones, the paired struts of the forearm. Then the thermal anomaly skeletons materialized, those fainter secondary forms displaced from the primary skeletal structure. And finally, on 3 of the 6 plates, the impossible additions became visible, structures that resembled jointed appendages extending from the shoulder blades, and what appeared to be a second jaw, articulated beneath the visible mandible, opened wide as though to receive something that the upper jaw could not accommodate. I transferred the plates to the stop bath, halting the development, then moved them to the fixer to make the images permanent. While they processed, I retrieved the wooden case from beneath my cot and unlocked it with the key I kept on a cord around my neck. Inside, the 43 previous plates lay in careful stacks, separated by sheets of archival paper to prevent emulsion damage. I added the 3 new plates showing impossible anatomy, bringing my collection to 46 documents of a phenomenon that violated everything I understood about human biology and photographic science. In the Archives of Clinical Pathology, Volendra 19, 1911, mention of unusual skeletal superimposition raises profound institutional concern regarding diagnostic interpretations. The case also contained a ledger I had been maintaining, a record of each session's participants, cross-referenced with observations about the vacancy phenomenon and notes about their photographic plates. The entries were coded using a system I had devised that would appear to an outside observer as routine equipment maintenance logs. But the codes concealed systematic documentation, patron names where I could obtain them, descriptions of their appearance and behavior, estimates of exposure duration, notes about the intensity and duration of observed vacancies, and assessments of their photographic plates' anomalous content. I had begun to discern patterns in the data. Patrons who returned for multiple exposures showed geometric progression in vacancy duration. A farmer who exhibited 3 seconds of vacancy during his first exposure showed 9 seconds during his second, 27 seconds during his third. A townsman's wife progressed from 2 seconds to 8 seconds to 32 seconds across 3 sessions, separated by single days. The progression suggested that repeated exposure to X-rays created cumulative effects, as though each session made the patron more susceptible to whatever process created the consciousness displacement. This operational integration of the machine's influence was a grim realization. The photographic evidence supported this interpretation. Patrons' first exposures typically showed only faint thermal anomaly skeletons, barely visible secondary structures that might be dismissed as processing artifacts. Second exposures revealed more pronounced thermal anomaly forms with clearer definition and the beginning of anatomical anomalies, extra digits, malformed joints, bone densities that appeared wrong. Third and subsequent exposures produced plates showing the fully developed impossible additions, the jointed appendages, the secondary jaws, and in the most extreme cases, what appeared to be additional skeletal structures occupying the same space as the normal skeleton, overlapping and interpenetrating in ways that should result in catastrophic physical interference, but somehow did not. I had photographed one patron, a banker from Salina who had attended 4 sessions across 2 weeks, whose final plate showed 3 complete skeletons occupying his body simultaneously, each slightly rotated relative to the others, creating a composite image that resembled a mechanical diagram more than human anatomy. The banker had exhibited 45 seconds of vacancy during that final session, standing motionless before the fluorescent screen while something else looked out through his eyes, and when his consciousness returned, he had complained of feeling unusually tired and had requested a chair to sit upon before departing the tent. The Pittsburgh Press, April 3, 1907, reported, "Industrial anomaly witnessed at Salina Fair. Operator insists on thermal anomaly explanation." I closed the ledger and locked the case, concealing it again beneath my cot. The developed plates had finished their fixing cycle. I rinsed them in clean water and hung them to dry from clips attached to a cord strung across the wagon's interior. In the red lantern light, the skeletal images appeared even more disturbing. The impossible anatomies rendered in shades of black and silver that suggested something captured from a realm where physical laws operated according to different principles. Industrial Safety Memorandum B1A. Personnel are reminded to report all unusual systemic aberrations. Tomorrow would bring additional sessions, additional exposures, additional entries in my coded ledger. The carnival would remain in Ellsworth for 2 more days before moving to its next engagement in Russell, where the harvest festivals would provide concentrated audiences willing to pay for scientific marvels and authenticated wonders. I would continue operating the Electricum Phantasma, continuing to collect dimes and display bones and accumulate photographic evidence of a phenomenon that transformed human anatomy into something other than human with each exposure to Röntgen's penetrating rays. I extinguished the red lantern and lay on my cot in the equipment wagon's darkness. Outside, the carnival's night sounds created their familiar symphony. The generator's diesel thrum, distant music from the carousel, voices of carnival workers securing equipment and counting receipts. Inside the wagon, the hanging photographic plates swayed slightly in air currents, their gelatin surfaces still damp, the impossible skeletons they documented slowly drying into permanent evidence of transactions I did not understand. The exchange of consciousness for vacancy, the replacement of human anatomy with architectures designed for purposes I could not fathom, the systematic transformation of Kansas farmers into something else, one 10-cent X-ray exposure at a time. The chilling reality of the asylum's perpetual dusk descended, a thick, cloying blanket that muffled thought, stifled breath. Inside, the hushed clamor of their lives, the clatter of metal instruments, the distant muffled pressure releases formed a symphony of systemic dread. Dr. Albright, a man whose features had long since blurred into the institution's bland conformity, paced the tiled corridor, his footsteps a rhythmic counterpoint to the distant hum of the facility's ventilation systems. His gaze, habitually detached, scanned the rows of bolted doors, each a sealed chamber of human despair, a contained anomaly. The air itself, heavy with the sterile scent of carbolic acid and something else, something metallic and faintly putrid, hinted at the profound operational inefficiencies within this place. Case File 7B, specifically the observations concerning Jonathan Vance, consumed his thoughts. Vance, a former assembly line foreman from the Allegheny Steelworks, had arrived 3 weeks prior, his mind a fractured landscape of gears and shadowed figures. The initial diagnosis, acute industrial melancholia, seemed a woefully inadequate description for the systemic breakdown observed. Albright paused at Vance's door, a heavy slab of reinforced oak. A faint scratching emanated from within, a persistent, unsettling cadence that resonated with the building's very foundations. It sounded like something trying to etch its way out, a desperate, systemic effort. He consulted his notes, the crisp pages rustling softly in the dim light. Journal of Industrial Medicine, Vol. 19. 1908, he murmured, reading a highlighted passage, notes the prevalence of cognitive occlusion syndrome among factory workers, exposed to prolonged monotonous tasks and low-frequency vibrations, exhibiting symptoms remarkably similar to those of Vance. The subject develops a profound disassociation from environmental stimuli, often manifesting as hallucinatory feedback loops. This clinical assessment, though accurate, failed to capture the palpable sense of unease, the near-tangible oppressive force that hung about Vance like a shroud. Albright felt a prickle of unease, a systemic tremor in his practiced composure. He unlocked the door, the heavy bolt drawing back with a metallic groan that echoed through the silent ward. The room was sparsely furnished, a cot, a wash basin, and a single barred window offering a sliver of the perpetually overcast sky. Jonathan Vance sat on the edge of his cot, perfectly still, his eyes wide and unfocused, fixed on some unseen point across the room. His hands, gnarled and powerful from years of heavy labor, clutched at the rough blanket. He was not merely catatonic. He was, Albright surmised, operationally integrated. The doctor stepped inside, his presence barely registering in the patient's field of perception. "Vance," Albright began, his voice calm, measured. "How are you feeling today?" There was no immediate response, only that unwavering stare. Then a low guttural murmur escaped Vance's lips, a sound devoid of human inflection, more akin to the grinding of unoiled machinery. "The gears," he rasped, his voice a dry, whispery mechanism. "They never stop." "They turn, Doctor. Always turning." Albright made a note, his pen scratching across the paper. Repetitive mechanical vocalization, consistent with previous observations. He knew the official psychiatric reports would categorize this as delusional ideation, but Albright, a man of science and a keen observer of human suffering, felt a creeping certainty that Vance was experiencing something far more insidious, something born of the very industrial landscape that had shaped his life. It was a systemic dread, a creeping fear that was palpable. A few days prior, a new nurse, Miss Eleanor Croft, had reported a strange thermal anomaly emanating from Vance's room, a sudden drop in ambient temperature that defied explanation. Pittsburgh Press, April 22, 1905. Unexplained refrigeration phenomenon reported at local asylum. Albright mused silently, recalling a sensationalized article from years past. He dismissed it then as journalistic hyperbole, but now, faced with Vance's unblinking stare and the peculiar chill in the air, he was not so sure. Industrial Safety Memorandum 12-C. All personnel are reminded to report unusual fluctuations in environmental conditions, as they may indicate structural compromise or unforeseen material discharges. The memorandum, a relic from a different sort of institution, resonated with a chilling prescience. He observed Vance for a long moment, the man's still figure a testament to some profound internal struggle. The former foreman's eyes seemed to hold a vast, unfathomable darkness, a systemic aberration that defied conventional medical understanding. It was as if the steel mills, with their deafening roar and relentless rhythm, had somehow imprinted themselves directly onto his very soul, leaving him operationally integrated with their ceaseless, unforgiving churn. The industrial anomaly, once external, now internal. Later that evening, as a tempest raged outside, rattling the asylum's antiquated windows, Albright found himself reviewing the hospital's maintenance logs. A series of unexplained power fluctuations had been reported in Vance's wing over the past week, coinciding with his arrival. An excerpt from the Journal of Industrial Mechanics, Volume 7, 1899 caught his eye, describing sporadic electromagnetic interference disrupting delicate machinery, often observed in close proximity to subterranean geological fissures. While the connection seemed tenuous, it added another layer of systemic unease to the growing dossier on Vance. The next morning, Miss Croft, her face pale and drawn, approached Albright. "Doctor," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the relentless rain. "Last night, I heard a pressure release from Mr. Vance's room. It wasn't human, it was mechanical." Her eyes, wide with a fear that bordered on panic, conveyed a deeper truth than her carefully chosen words. Albright recalled the mandatory terminology conversion, scream to pressure release. Her description was disturbingly accurate, clinically precise. He knew what she meant. He had heard it too, a low metallic shriek, not of flesh and bone, but something far colder, far more alien. The previous night, sensing a disturbance, he had rushed to Vance's room. The door, despite being securely locked, had presented a curious resistance, a strange, resilient vibration that made the wood feel almost alive. He forced it open, only to find Vance calm, still staring at the wall. The intense smell of ozone, however, was undeniable. Albright noted this down. Unexplained thermal and auditory emissions from cell 7B, possible electrical short circuit, or localized atmospheric ionization. A meticulously logical framework for an impossibly illogical phenomenon. Albright began to suspect that Vance was not merely suffering from mental illness, but was, in fact, becoming a conduit, a living manifestation of the industrial age's darkest anxieties. The systemic dread of the machines, the relentless grind of progress, had found purchase within his shattered mind. The steel mills had consumed Jonathan Vance, not just physically but spiritually. He was now a mechanically compromised vessel, operationally integrated into a terrifying industrial anomaly. The doctor found himself increasingly drawn to the technical reports from the Allegheny Steelworks concerning Vance's final shift. An industrial accident, officially categorized as operator error due to fatigue, had resulted in a catastrophic rupture of a Bessemer converter. Pittsburgh Press, October 4, 1903. "Steel mill disaster claims foreman Vance's crew," the headline had read. Albright remembered the grim details, the reports of molten metal cascading, the horrific pressure releases of steam and gas as the structural integrity of the apparatus failed. The accident claimed not only Vance's crew, but it seemed a part of his very being. He reread an excerpt from the factory's internal investigation report. Despite rigorous adherence to Industrial Safety Bulletin 34F, Protocol for High-Temperature Liquid Metal Containment, a systemic failure occurred at juncture point Delta 7, leading to an uncontrolled discharge. The sheer pressure exerted at this point exceeded anticipated tolerances following unexpected material fatigue. This bureaucratic language, designed to depersonalize and quantify tragedy, now seemed to highlight the terrifying, impersonal nature of the forces at play within Vance. Albright decided to consult the asylum's nascent electrical engineer, a young, ambitious man named Mr. Davies. Davies, though skeptical, agreed to install a series of rudimentary sensors in Vance's room. A thermocouple to monitor temperature, a seismograph to detect vibrations, and a rudimentary electromagnetic field detector. The results were perplexing. Random erratic spikes in all three readings, often occurring simultaneously, without any discernible external cause. The needle of the electromagnetic detector would occasionally flutter wildly, as if in the presence of a powerful unseen current. One evening, as Albright reviewed the printouts from Davies's sensors, a sudden surge of cold air swept through his office, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of iron residue. The readings from Vance's room, just moments before stable, had spiked exponentially. The thermocouple registered an impossible drop in temperature. The seismograph twitched with micro-tremors, and the electromagnetic detector hummed with an almost audible current. It was a pressure release, a profound internal release of energy. He rushed to Vance's room, Davies close behind him, his face etched with a mixture of fear and scientific curiosity. The door, when Albright wrenched it open, emitted a low, resonant groan as if protesting the intrusion. Inside, the air was intensely cold, and a faint shimmering haze seemed to distort the very perception of space. Jonathan Vance lay on his cot, his eyes still open, but now they glowed with a faint internal luminescence, like embers barely contained within a furnace. "The gears," Vance rasped, his voice a low mechanical growl. "They shift, always shifting. The great press, Albright. It descends." His voice was no longer his own. It was deep, resonant, amplified by some unseen mechanism, a fundamental, undeniable industrial anomaly. He was speaking not with his own words, but with the systemic logic of the machinery that had consumed him. Davies, his face pale, pointed a trembling finger at the wall behind Vance's head. A faint, almost imperceptible dark stain had appeared, seeping slowly from the plaster. It was unmistakably iron residue. Journal of Pathology, Voluntary 12, 1901, Albright thought, recalling an article on spontaneous cellular necrosis. But this was not biological decomposition. This was a manifestation of something far colder, far more mechanical. It was the physical bleed-through of a man's essence, transformed into the very substance of his torment. The chilling reality of their situation dawned on Albright. Vance was not mad. He was transformed. He was a mechanically compromised entity, a living, breathing industrial anomaly. The asylum, designed to contain the aberrations of the human mind, was now housing something far more profound, a terrifying fusion of man and machine, a systemic aberration that defied all medical explanation. The institution itself was becoming operationally integrated with its most unsettling patient. Albright, a man of science, felt the cold tendrils of systemic dread wrap around him, a fear far greater than any personal anguish. It was the fear of the unknown, of a reality slowly but inexorably bending to the will of an impersonal mechanical force. He looked at Vance, the still figure on the cot, and saw not a man but a silent testament to the insidious power of the age, a stark warning of the price exacted by relentless progress. The asylum, with its cold steel and sterile corridors, was no longer a refuge but a laboratory, observing the terrifying evolution of human suffering into something profoundly, mechanically other. The machine was not external. It was within, and it was waiting. The lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the antechamber. A pressure release erupted from the observation room, sharp and sudden, followed by a heavy metallic thud. Dr. Armitage, his spectacles glinting in the gloom, scribbled furiously on his notepad. "Subject 7 Gamma exhibits heightened internal pressures," he muttered, indicating systemic dysfunction within cerebral pathways. The air grew thick, humid with a strange metallic tang, an iron residue that seemed to seep from the very walls. He felt a chilling certainty, a creeping dread that solidified with every passing moment. This facility, built deep within the earth, was not merely mechanically compromised. It was an industrial anomaly, a testament to man's hubris. He reviewed his notes from the day. The recent report from the deep excavation team had been troubling. Pittsburgh Press, October 22, 1908. Coal seam collapse claims 6 miners. The unusual geological formations reported. The article described an unprecedented structural failure, a deep tremor unlike any recorded. Could it be linked? The logical pathways of his mind struggled to connect the data. The subject had arrived from that very region, retrieved from the collapsed strata, a still figure amidst the wreckage. Earlier, during the preliminary assessment, a junior technician had reported anomalous thermal readings emanating from their charge. "The subject displays an inexplicable thermal anomaly, sir. Consistently elevated despite cryogenic containment procedures." Armitage had dismissed it as faulty equipment, a calibration error, yet the readings persisted, a persistent whisper of the impossible. Now the internal pressure release, the faint acrid smell. It suggested something far more sinister than a simple malfunction. His gaze drifted to the reinforced steel door of the observation room, a formidable barrier against whatever lay beyond. The facility's primary objective, as outlined in Industrial Safety Bulletin, Number 12A, Protocols for Containment of Unclassified Geological Anomalies, was absolute isolation and study. Yet what if the anomaly was not merely geological but organic? What if it possessed an intelligence, a malevolent will operating outside the known principles of physics and biology? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He recalled the early days of its discovery, the initial euphoria replaced by a creeping unease. The engineers, their faces grim, had reported inexplicable surges in power, fluctuations that defied explanation. "The power grid is exhibiting an erratic load, Doctor," the chief engineer had stated, his voice laced with concern. "It's as if something is drawing energy, an unseen drain." Armitage had attributed it to geological instability, perhaps dormant pockets of charged minerals. But as documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 16, 1906, initial psychological impact of prolonged subterranean operations on mining personnel highlighted the propensity for workers to attribute natural phenomena to malevolent forces, a psychological defense mechanism against the overwhelming dangers of their profession. He had to remain objective. The still figure in the observation room lay motionless, seemingly inert, yet the monitoring equipment showed a continuous, subtle and disturbing activity. The heart, if it could be called that, beat with an irregular, almost mechanical rhythm, a metronome counting down to an unknown catastrophic failure. The breathing, shallow and infrequent, suggested a dormant state, a hibernation. But for how long? And what would awaken it? He flipped to a new page in his notebook, the pen scratching against the paper. Hypothesis. The subject, provisionally designated Deep Earth Anomaly 7 Gamma, displays characteristics consistent with an organism capable of drawing sustenance from ambient energy fluctuations, potentially exacerbating subterranean instability. It sounded scientific, medical even, a shield against the creeping sense of dread. But in his heart, he knew he was playing a dangerous game, attempting to categorize something that defied all classification. The air conditioning hummed, a constant low drone, the only sound apart from his own labored breathing. The facility was designed to be a bastion of scientific inquiry, a sterile environment for the study of the unknown. But the unknown in this case was not merely an object. It felt like a conscious entity, an operationally integrated being with an alien purpose. The initial survey team had reported a pervasive sense of psychological disorientation, later attributed to deep earth pressure sickness. Pittsburgh Press, August 3, 1903, Deep Earth Syndrome. Hits miners. Workers report hallucinations and paranoia. The article had detailed the alarming rise in psychological breakdowns amongst those excavating the deepest veins. Armitage reviewed the schematics of the containment chamber. Layer upon layer of reinforced adamantine, magnetic shielding and bioscanners. Industrial Safety Bulletin number 23C, Biohazard Containment Breach Protocols, detailed the step-by-step procedures in case of an escape, a stark reminder of the potential consequences. Yet what if the threat isn't a physical breach, but something more insidious, a psychological contagion? He remembered the words of Dr. Alistair Finch, his former mentor, a brilliant but eccentric geologist. "The Earth is not merely rock and soil, Armitage. It breathes. It has its own consciousness, an ancient, systemically aberrant will that predates all of humanity." Armitage had scoffed then, attributing Finch's theories to stress and overwork. Now alone in the dim light of the antechamber, Finch's words echoed with an unsettling prescience. The pressure release from the observation room ceased, replaced by an unnerving silence. The power fluctuations, which had been subtle, suddenly intensified, causing the lights to dim momentarily before flaring back to full intensity. A high-pitched whine emanated from the containment field, a sound that grated on the nerves, a mechanical interpretation of a pressure release. His hand trembled as he reached for the intercom. "Status report, Observation Team Beta," he commanded, his voice betraying a hint of unease. Only static replied. The silence stretched, pregnant with menace. He felt a sudden, inexplicable coldness, as if the very air was being drained of warmth. The iron residue smell intensified, becoming almost overwhelming. This was not a malfunction. This was a progression, an emergence. He consulted a medical text. Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 18, 1909. Unexplained neurological deterioration in subterranean personnel. The symptoms described: acute paranoia, sudden sensory overload, visual and auditory hallucinations, leading to complete psychological collapse. Were these the effects of deep earth pressure, or something else entirely? The containment chamber was an engineering marvel, designed to withstand unimaginable forces. Yet the current operational data, indicated a gradual but undeniable increase in internal vibrational frequencies within the chamber itself. A structural engineer, upon reviewing the data, had attributed it to harmonic resonance within the geological strata. Armitage knew better. The source was internal. He glanced at the security monitors. The camera feed from the observation room was now flickering, displaying intermittent static. Then, for a brief, horrifying second, he saw it. A dark shape, indistinct but undeniably shifting within the chamber. It was no longer a still figure. It was moving. A frantic tapping sound emerged from the wall beside him, a rhythmic metallic clicking that seemed to emanate from within the very structure of the facility. It began slowly, then accelerated, a cacophony of sound, a mechanical warning. The lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the room into near darkness before returning to a sickly amber glow. His mind raced, desperately seeking a scientific, logical explanation. But the logic pathways were failing, succumbing to the overwhelming evidence of the unexplainable. The operationally integrated subject was no longer contained. It was asserting its presence. The facility designed to control was slowly but surely being controlled. He looked around the cold, sterile antechamber, the instruments humming, the monitors displaying their erratic data. The true horror wasn't the creature itself, but the realization of human powerlessness against a systemically aberrant intelligence, an industrial anomaly that defied every known law. He was not just a scientist. He was an entomologist observing a spider, trapped in its own web. The tapping from the wall intensified, morphing into a grinding sound, a structural stress indicator. Then a pressure release, sharper and more violent than before, emanated from the observation room. He knew with an absolute certainty that the true nature of their discovery was about to be revealed, and humanity would be utterly unprepared for its implications. The facility, this grand bastion of scientific endeavor, was about to become something else entirely. It was becoming a tomb. The flickering gas lamps cast long, disquieting shadows across the polished oak of the asylum's main hall. Dr. Alistair Finch clutched his case notes, the leather worn and familiar, yet he felt a tremor shake despite its tactile comfort. His latest patient, a Miss Eleanor Vance, exhibited symptoms that defied traditional psychiatric classification. Her previous physician, a Dr. Eldridge, had merely scribbled delusional psychosis and washed his hands of the case, but Finch suspected something far more insidious, a systemic aberration in the patient's very cognitive framework. He reviewed his notes again, the fine script detailing unsettling observations. Eleanor spoke of whispers from the walls, of unseen hands that manipulated her environment. Finch, a man of science, sought a rational explanation, a mechanical equivalent for every perceived supernatural occurrence. Yet a cold dread began to seep into his carefully constructed professional stoicism, a systemic dread. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Vol. 14, 1903, cases of inexplicable motor dysfunction and cognitive dissociation necessitate a more rigorous examination of environmental factors, particularly in industrial settings. This reminded him of Eleanor's cryptic remarks concerning localized atmospheric variations. Eleanor's admission form listed her occupation as a textile worker, specifically in a mill known for its antiquated and perpetually malfunctioning machinery. He remembered reading a Pittsburgh Press, March 15, 1897. Factory incident claims 2. 2 operatives were gravely injured at the Monongahela textile mill yesterday following a catastrophic loom malfunction. Authorities cite operator error. Such incidents, while tragic, were commonplace in the burgeoning industrial landscape. Could her condition be an echo of these mechanical compromises? A trauma imprinted not just on her mind, but on the very fabric of her being, making her operationally integrated into a larger, unseen system of decay. Finch approached her cell, the heavy iron door clanging shut with a finality that always sent a shiver down his spine. The nurse, a stoic woman named Agnes, stood watchful. "She's been quiet, Doctor," Agnes reported, her voice hushed. Hardly a pressure release all night. "Just stares at the ceiling." He entered the sparsely furnished room. Eleanor sat on the edge of her cot, her eyes wide and fixed on the corner of the ceiling, as if observing a complex, invisible mechanism at work. Her thin nightgown barely concealed her emaciated frame. "Miss Vance," Finch began, his voice calm and measured, "how are you feeling this morning?" She turned her head slowly, her gaze sweeping over him, not with fear, but with a detached clinical assessment. "The thermal anomaly is still present, Dr. Finch," she stated, her voice a low murmur devoid of emotional inflection. "It pulses at irregular intervals, a direct current of influence." Finch scribbled furiously in his notebook. He often found her descriptions unsettlingly precise, like an engineer diagnosing a faulty machine. "And this influence, Miss Vance, what does it do?" "It processes data," she replied, her eyes returning to the ceiling. "Compresses reality, rewrites parameters. I am merely a conduit, Doctor, a terminal in a compromised network." Her words, once mere ravings, now resonated with a chilling technical logic. He wondered if this was a new form of operational integration, one born not of supernatural force, but of industrial trauma, making her operationally integrated into a systemic aberration. He pressed further. "Can you describe the sensations you experience when this thermal anomaly is active?" "A low hum," she explained, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on her palm. "A vibration beneath the skin. Not pain precisely, but a rearrangement, like cogs shifting or gears grinding down." Her description was disturbingly similar to the sounds of the textile mill, the very institution that had shaped her and perhaps broken her. Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B. Regarding steam pressure protocols and their impact on operative auditory health should be reviewed. The bulletin advised ear protection, a measure rarely enforced in antiquated factories. Finch remembered a case from his early residency. A man convinced his iron residue had turned to molten lead. He'd dismissed it as a somatic delusion. But Eleanor's methodical descriptions were different. She spoke of the very functioning of her body as a factory in distress. "I can feel the iron residue accumulating," she said, tapping her finger gently against her temple. "The filters are failing. The system is overloading." This wasn't the irrational fear of a madwoman. It was the detached, almost diagnostic self-assessment of a machine experiencing a catastrophic failure. He spent another hour with her, charting her bizarre yet internally consistent system of delusions. She spoke of maintenance checks performed by unseen mechanics, of data packets that entered her mind without consent. It was as if her consciousness had been invaded, not by a malevolent spirit, but by a pervasive, suffocating industrial process. The very air of the asylum began to feel heavy, not with the typical melancholic weight, but with a different kind of pressure, the unseen strain of a vast, unseen mechanism. Later that evening, back in his study, Finch pored over articles detailing occupational diseases. He found a report in the British Medical Journal 1892 regarding atmospheric contamination and its unforeseen neurological impacts on factory operatives. The language, though clinical, hinted at unseen dangers in the air, in the very environment of factory workers. Could Eleanor's thermal anomaly be a byproduct of such unseen pollutants, a physical manifestation of a systemic pathology? He recalled another recent incident, a night watchman at the asylum who had experienced sudden debilitating tremors. The man had quit, claiming the building was mechanically compromised, that he could hear the metal groaning. Finch had attributed it to fatigue and superstition at the time. Now Eleanor's words, "The filters are failing," echoed in his mind, suggesting a deeper, more pervasive issue within the very structure of their environment. Was the asylum itself, this institution of healing, operationally integrated into the same systemic rot? The lamp's flame flickered again, casting an elongated shadow that danced on the wall. For a moment, it seemed to coalesce into a hulking industrial anomaly, a spectral machine composed of gears and steam, its intent ambiguous but undeniably present. Finch rubbed his temples. The sheer exhaustion of dealing with such cases was immense. He was a scientist, a man of logic, yet the lines between the rational and the seemingly irrational were blurring. He thought of the still figures he had seen in the morgue, the finality of their silence. Eleanor's descriptions of her internal breakdowns felt chillingly similar to the processes of decay, the slow, methodical dismantling of a mechanism, the conversion of a living system into a collection of inert components, a still figure. The following morning, Finch received an urgent summons from Agnes. Eleanor had experienced another episode. He rushed to her room, his heart pounding with an unknown dread, a systemic dread. As he approached, He heard a low, sustained pressure release emanating from her cell, a sound not of human despair, but of a mechanism under immense duress. He threw open the door. Eleanor was thrashing on her cot, her body seized by violent convulsions. Her eyes were rolled back, and from her mouth oozed a thick, dark substance. Not iron residue, he quickly observed, but iron residue. It coated her lips, stained her gown. It was as if the very machinery of her body was expelling its waste products, undergoing a final, grotesque operational integration. Agnes stood frozen, holding a bucket, her face ashen. It came from inside her, Doctor. Finch reacted quickly, calling for orderlies, for sedatives. As they worked to restrain her, Eleanor let out another pressure release, a sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the air itself. Not a human cry, but the shriek of overworked pistons. Her eyes, when they briefly focused, were wide and terrifyingly lucid, filled with the knowledge of a system in catastrophic failure. She was not operationally integrated by an industrial anomaly, but consumed by an industrial anomaly, a systemic aberration that had taken root within her, turning her into a living, breathing factory of horror. The events that followed spiraled into a whirlwind of frantic medical intervention, failed attempts at stabilization, and ultimately, despair. Eleanor Vance, the textile worker, the patient with delusional psychosis, became a still figure. Her death certificate listed cardiac arrest as the cause, a convenient and medically plausible explanation. But Finch knew better. He knew it was something far deeper, far more insidious. He recalled the Pittsburgh Press, May 22, 1902, the unexplained collapse at factory. Investigation inconclusive. A worker at the Acme Bolton Nut Counter mysteriously succumbed to acute respiratory distress amidst reports of strange atmospheric conditions. He reviewed his notes again, the chilling precision of Eleanor's descriptions. The thermal anomaly is still present, she had said. It pulses at irregular intervals, a direct current of influence. Was it possible that the mill, with its antiquated machinery and polluted air, acted as a strange kind of conduit, a gateway for something not supernatural but industrial, a pervasive, unseen force that could systematically compromise human beings, turning them into components of its own horrific design? Finch felt a profound shift within his own logical framework. He had sought to understand her condition through the lens of science, to find mechanical equivalents for her perceived supernatural experiences. But what if the mechanical itself had become the source of terror? What if the relentless march of industry, the ceaseless grind of gears and steam, had produced a new kind of thermal anomaly? A thermal anomaly that could operationally integrate into the human system, turning flesh and bone into a grotesquely efficient engine of despair. He reread the Industrial Safety Bulletin 1908 to see. The prolonged exposure to certain industrial byproducts may induce psychological distress and systemic dysfunction in operatives. He looked out his window at the gaslit streets of the city, at the distant glow of the factory districts, their smokestacks belching dark plumes into the night sky. The sound of a distant train whistle, a mournful metallic cry echoed through the quiet. He wondered how many more Eleanor Vances were out there. How many individuals were slowly but surely becoming operationally integrated into a larger, systemic aberration, their minds and bodies corrupted by the relentless hum of progress, by the very forces designed to improve human life. The thought chilled him to the bone, a systemic dread far more potent than any fear of the supernatural. The asylum, designed to mend minds, was merely a holding pen, a repair shop for a system that was fundamentally mechanically compromised. And he, Dr. Alistair Finch, was merely a technician, patching up broken circuits in a world succumbing to a new industrial form of horror. The grinding cacophony of the factory floor had become a familiar companion, a metallic lullaby lulling the night shift into a trance of repetitive toil. Thomas, his eyes heavy-lidded, adjusted his spectacles, the grime-encrusted lenses doing little to sharpen the edges of his vision. He'd seen worse, much worse, in the 10 years he'd spent within these cavernous walls, the air thick with coal dust and the acrid tang of hot metal. Tonight, however, an unfamiliar tremor ran through the foundations, a low resonant hum that vibrated through his very bones, distinct from the usual industrial symphony. It wasn't the rhythmic thud of the stamping press, nor the shriek of the steam whistles. This was deeper, more insidious, like the faint, persistent throb of a dying heart. Thomas dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of his weary mind. He clutched his thermos, the lukewarm coffee doing little to dispel the creeping chill that had inexplicably settled into the enormous machine shop. Suddenly, a massive pressure release erupted from the far side of the factory, a sound that ripped through the metallic clangor, silencing even the titanic hammers. Workers closest to the source recoiled, their faces contorted in a grotesque ballet of shared apprehension. A column of scalding steam, thick and opaque, billowed up, momentarily obscuring the looming silhouette of the colossal generator, a behemoth of iron and brass. When the steam began to dissipate, it revealed not a typical mechanical failure, but a series of alarming observations that defied standard engineering protocols. A dark, viscous fluid, later identified as high-concentration iron residue, oozed from a rupture in a pressure valve, staining the unpainted concrete floor with a gruesome, spreading slick. The air, already heavy with industrial effluvia, now carried an inexplicable coppery aroma, a scent that prickled the back of Thomas's throat. "By the saints," muttered Elijah, a grizzled foreman whose face was permanently etched with lines of worry, his voice barely audible above the renewed din. "What fresh systemically aberrant malfunction is this?" His gaze, usually sharp and authoritative, was now clouded with a nascent dread, a raw primal fear that transcended the everyday hazards of their grueling profession. He pulled a grease-stained rag from his pocket, nervously wiping his grimy hands, a gesture he reserved for moments of profound and inexplicable distress. The rhythmic pulse emanating from the generator intensified, a steady, ponderous beat that seemed to resonate with an unnatural, almost predatory cadence. It felt less like a machine and more like a monstrous awakening entity. A younger worker, Samuel, his face pale beneath the factory's harsh electric lights, pointed a trembling finger towards the generator. "Look, on the casing." His voice, normally boisterous, was now a strained whisper, barely more than a gasp. A shimmering thermal anomaly, indistinct yet undeniably present, flickered across the generator's immense metallic surface. It pulsed with an internal luminescence, a faint, sickly green light that seemed to emanate from within the very heart of the machine, as if some unspeakable energy was struggling to break free. It was not a reflection. It was a phenomenon, an inexplicable distortion of light and heat that defied all known physical laws. The anomaly seemed to hum, a low, almost subsonic thrum that made the fillings in Thomas's teeth ache. Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B, regarding steam pressure protocols, indicates strict adherence to gauge readings, barked Elijah, his voice struggling to recapture its former authority, though his eyes never left the unsettling thermal anomaly. "No reading should ever exceed this." His voice trailed off, his words swallowed by the oppressive weight of the moment. The anomaly pulsed again, brighter this time, casting eerie, shifting, phosphorescent shadows across the workshop. Thomas felt a prickle of sweat run down his spine, a testament to the unnerving spectacle unfolding before him. It was a sight that conjured ancient, forgotten fears, a chilling blend of technological dread and primal terror. Suddenly another, louder pressure release echoed through the factory, this one more guttural, more violent. A section of rivets on the generator's main housing blew, launching lethal shards of metal across the floor. One caught a worker in the leg. Pittsburgh Press, October 23, 1902. Factory incident claims 2, injures several more. The incident, though tragic, was almost overshadowed by what happened next. The thermal anomaly pulsed furiously, now swirling and coalescing into a vaguely humanoid outline against the generator's still humming surface. It wasn't a shadow. It was a distortion, a three-dimensional manifestation of pure heat, shimmering and wavering like a mirage. "It's operationally integrated," Samuel whispered, his voice trembling, his eyes wide with a horrifying understanding. "It's become a part of the machine." He backed away slowly, his footfalls crunching on the fallen rivets. The air grew perceptibly colder around the anomaly, a stark contradiction to its visual intensity, as if the very warmth of the factory was being siphoned away. The raw coppery smell intensified, becoming cloying, sickeningly sweet. Thomas felt a tightening in his chest, a constriction he recognized as acute systemic dread. He had witnessed countless accidents, seen men mangled by machinery, but nothing had ever prepared him for this. From the now ruptured casing, a thin black tendril like a strand of hardened tar snaked out, It was too fluid to be electrical wiring, too solid to be escaping steam. It writhed, exploring the air, then lashed out, striking a control panel. Sparks showered, and a pressure release system for the automated conveyor belt engaged prematurely, sending a cascade of heavy metal parts tumbling in a deafening clatter. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 14, 1903, the psychological impact of unforeseen mechanical failures can induce catatonia. Thomas felt a profound numbness, a terrifying detachment, as he observed the monstrous transformation of the generator. Elijah, his face now a mask of grim resignation, grabbed a wrench, a futile weapon against such an adversary. "Back you! Industrial anomaly!" he bellowed, his voice filled with a desperate, impotent rage. The black tendril recoiled slightly, as if sensing the defiance, then struck again with greater force, impacting a worker's arm. The sound of bone snapping was sickeningly clear amidst the factory's renewed cacophony. The worker slumped to the floor, a still figure amidst the metallic chaos, his body a silent testament to the machine's new, terrifying power. Thomas, despite his fear, found himself strangely compelled to approach. He felt himself drawn by an irresistible, horrifying curiosity, a morbid fascination with the unfolding systemic aberration. The thermal anomaly on the generator now pulsed with a malevolent rhythm, its greenish glow deepening into an emerald hue. Below it, the black tendril began to thicken, to coalesce, taking on a more defined, almost skeletal form. It was as if the very essence of the factory, its iron and steam, its relentless, unfeeling purpose, was manifesting into something corporeal and terrifying. "This is beyond repair," Elijah muttered, his voice raw, defeat etched into every line of his weather-beaten face. "This is mechanistically compromised." He dropped the wrench, the metallic clatter echoing the definitive surrender in his voice. The rhythmic thrumming from the generator intensified further, becoming a deafening, oppressive beat that vibrated through the very floor. The air, already thick with the smells of coal and iron, now had a distinct burnt aroma, like scorched flesh. The black figure, now fully formed and vaguely anthropomorphic, detached itself from the generator with a terrible, sucking sound. It was tall, gaunt, and composed of shifting, shadowy material, with pinpricks of green light like malevolent eyes burning in its head. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs extending and retracting with impossible flexibility. Its movements were too precise, too deliberate, for a mere agglomeration of industrial detritus. It was a dark reflection of the factory itself, a monstrous embodiment of its tireless, destructive power. A pressure release, shrill and agonizing, tore from Samuel's throat as the industrial anomaly turned towards him. The sound was not human. It was a primal, animalistic shriek of pure terror, a sound that would forever haunt Thomas's nightmares. The figure reached out with a long, skeletal hand, its shadowy fingers ending in razor-sharp points. Samuel stumbled backward, tripping over a discarded gear, his face frozen in a rictus of pure, unadulterated fear. Industrial Safety Bulletin, 1908C. Protocol for severe operational shutdowns. Evacuate all non-essential personnel immediately, Thomas tried to recall, his mind a whirlwind of fear and bureaucratic procedures. But the words felt hollow, meaningless against the horrific reality unfolding before him. The situation had surpassed anything described in any safety manual. This wasn't a malfunction. It was an entity. The anomaly advanced relentlessly, its green eyes glowing with an unsettling intelligence. It was not merely mechanical, it was maliciously intelligent, a systemically aberrant construct with a terrible purpose. Its form pulsed with dark energy, radiating an aura of profound, inhuman coldness. It felt as if cold iron had come alive, infused with an unnatural and malevolent spirit, an abomination born of the industrial age. The other workers, galvanized by Samuel's pressure release, began to scatter, their fear overcoming their ingrained discipline. They stumbled over machinery, their panic contagious, their faces contorted in wide-eyed horror. The factory, usually a place of regulated chaos, descended into a pandemonium of fleeing figures and desperate cries. The sounds of their frantic steps and choked breaths were a testament to the absolute terror the anomaly inspired. Thomas, however, remained rooted to the spot, a horrifying fascination paralyzing him. He watched, utterly mesmerized, as the shadowy entity closed in on Samuel. The coppery scent in the air intensified, becoming almost unbearable, like the smell of a slaughterhouse. The figure loomed over Samuel, a grotesque, towering silhouette against the steam and dim factory lights. With a final terrible pressure release, Samuel collapsed, his body a crumpled, still figure on the concrete. The industrial anomaly then turned its glowing green eyes towards Thomas. A wave of profound, soul-crushing dread washed over him, a cold, clinical certainty of his impending demise. It was not merely personal fear. It was systemic dread, the realization that he was utterly powerless against this new, monstrous manifestation of the factory itself. Pittsburgh Press, November 11th, 1905. Fatal accident at Miller Foundry. Cause unknown, investigation underway. The words, unbidden, flashed through Thomas's mind, a chilling premonition of his own fate. He was just another statistic, another part of the system that would be quietly documented, filed away, and forgotten. The anomaly moved with surprising speed, its shadowy form gliding across the floor, barely touching the ground. The sound of its approach was not footsteps. It was a low vibrational hum, a sound that resonated deep within Thomas's skull. His heart hammered in his chest, a frantic, desperate drum against the overwhelming silence of his own terror. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but his limbs wouldn't obey. He was an observer, a victim, caught in the grip of an unstoppable, systemically aberrant force. As the industrial anomaly drew nearer, Thomas could discern faint, metallic whispers emanating from its shadowy form. Sounds that were not words but the faint, distorted echoes of machinery, the tortured groans of stressed metal, the rhythmic pulse of unseen engines. It was the voice of the factory, given tangible, terrifying form. It was a mechanical language of suffering, of relentless, destructive progress. The green eyes of the anomaly widened, burning brighter like twin furnaces. Its shadowy hand, now fully extended, reached out towards Thomas, its razor-sharp fingers spread wide. He could see, or imagine he could see, the glint of unseen gears and pistons within its perpetually shifting form. It was a monstrous composite, an impossibly complex living machine, forged from the very essence of the mill. His last conscious thought was not of escape, but of the cold, impersonal records that would document his passing. He would become another still figure, another entry in the ledger of lives consumed by the insatiable maw of industry. His personal story would dissolve into the systemic data, a small, insignificant casualty in the relentless march of progress. The pervasive coppery smell filled his lungs, a final, suffocating testament to the industrial anomaly's presence. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, volume number 19, 1909, instances of sudden arterial pressure collapse due to extreme psychic trauma are infrequent but recorded. The anomaly's shadow enveloped him, cold and absolute, the green eyes the last thing he saw. A final internal pressure release, silent and invisible, erupted within him as the entity's touch met his skin, an unbearable, frigid contact that stole the very breath from his lungs. Then only silence, broken by the perpetual, unfeeling hum of the vast, indifferent factory. He became another indistinguishable part of the relentless, unforgiving industrial system, a still figure, permanently integrated. The flickering gaslight cast elongated shadows across the foreman's grim face, a testament to the factory's relentless appetite. Dust, thick and pervasive, coated every surface, a fine grey shroud clinging to the air itself. The rhythmic clang of the stamping presses echoed from the deeper recesses of the plant, a ceaseless heartbeat that seemed to regulate the very breathing of the men toiling within its bowels. Young Thomas, barely a man, wiped sweat from his brow with a grimy sleeve, his eyes darting apprehensively towards the massive central conveyor belt, its gears grinding relentlessly. There had been talk amongst the older hands, hushed whispers of strange occurrences, of machinery developing peculiar malfunctions. "Another breakdown on line 3, grunted Foreman Davies, his voice raspy from years of shouting over the din. He gestured with a wrench towards a section of the conveyor, where a large, irregularly shaped object had become jammed, halting its ponderous movement. "Looks like a systemic anomaly again. The usual." Thomas felt a familiar knot tighten in his gut. These anomalies had grown more frequent, each one stranger than the last. He remembered Old Man Hemlock's tale the other night, of a cold spot in the forging room, of tools clattering to the floor when no one was near. He swallowed, the grit in his mouth tasting like fear. "It's not just a jam, sir," Thomas ventured, his voice barely audible above the industrial clamor. "It feels different," Davies snorted, adjusting his cap. "Everything feels different when you're new, lad. Now get over there. We need this line running. Production quotas won't meet themselves." Thomas trudged towards the stalled machinery, the massive gears looming over him like the teeth of some colossal slumbering beast. The air around the anomaly felt noticeably cooler, a chilling draft that defied the stifling heat of the factory floor. He reached the obstruction, his fingers brushing against its cold, uneven surface. It wasn't metal, not wood, not anything he recognized. It was slick, almost gelatinous, yet firm to the touch. A faint, almost imperceptible pulsation emanated from it, as documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine. The Volon 14, 1903. Unexplained localized temperature. Drops within industrial environments warrant immediate investigation due to potential atmospheric disturbances leading to worker disorientation and subsequent operational incidents. He recoiled, a surge of adrenaline coursing through him. This was beyond a simple mechanical failure. This was something else entirely. He could hear the low guttural growl of the machinery striving to overcome the blockage, the stress on its components immense. Suddenly a section of the anomaly shifted, revealing a dark, cavernous void within its mass. A profound dread settled over him, the systemic dread of a man confronting an impossible truth within a world built on rational mechanics. This was not a malfunction. It was an intrusion, a violation of the factory's very logic. Foreman Davies, growing impatient, stomped over. "What's the hold-up, Thomas? Are you daft?" He peered at the anomaly, his brow furrowing. "What in blazes is that?" He reached out, his calloused hand making contact with the pulpy substance. His eyes widened, a flicker of something akin to terror joining the usual irritation. The object began to expand, slowly at first, then with an unsettling deliberation, causing the heavy conveyor belt to strain and groan even louder. The metallic shriek of overstressed components filled the air, a high-pitched pressure release that sent shivers down Thomas's spine. Pittsburgh Press, March 15, 1897. Factory Incident Claims 2. Reports from the Consolidated Steelworks indicate a catastrophic failure on the main assembly line yesterday evening. 2 employees, identified as Bartholomew Jenkins and Silas Croft, perished following a localized structural collapse. Witnesses reported unusual material accumulation prior to the event. The anomaly pulsed faster now, a sickening organic beat against the steel and iron of the factory. The void within it deepened, and Thomas could discern faint, unsettling movements inside. It was like looking into a disturbed hive of some unseen, monstrous insect. The air grew colder, and the gaslights flickered wildly, threatening to plunge them into shadow. A heavy, cloying scent, like ozone mixed with something putridly sweet, began to permeate the factory. Industrial Safety Memorandum 47B. Regarding steam pressure protocols, all personnel are reminded that atypical pressure fluctuations, particularly those without a discernible mechanical origin, must be reported to supervisory staff immediately. Failure to adhere to these guidelines may result in severe operational integration. Thomas felt a chilling certainty that this was not merely a fault in the machinery. It was the machinery itself becoming fundamentally corrupted, operationally integrated with something alien and malevolent. He wanted to shout, to warn the others, but his voice caught in his throat. The apprehension was a tangible thing, a cold hand squeezing his windpipe. Davies, however, was past fear. His eyes were wide and unblinking, fixed on the growing anomaly. He seemed mesmerized, drawn in by its hypnotic, rhythmic expansion. The object now spanned the entire width of the conveyor, its dark, rubbery mass pressing against the supporting girders. The deep, rumbling growl of the plant's engine room seemed to waver, its steady rhythm faltering, as if struggling against an invisible opponent. Then, with a sickening squelch, the anomaly expanded further, tearing a section of the conveyor plating away. A gush of dark, viscous fluid, thick as crude oil, streamed from the wound, smelling faintly of iron residue. The stench was overwhelming, burning Thomas's nostrils. It's feeding," Davies whispered, his voice hoarse, a look of abject horror on his face. He didn't try to pull away. Thomas saw his hand, still resting on the anomaly, begin to sink into its depths, slowly, inexorably, as if swallowed by quicksand. A low internal churning sound emanated from the mass, a sound of digestion. Thomas watched in paralyzed horror as Davies's arm, then his shoulder, were absorbed. His strained gasp, a faint pressure release as his body was consumed. Industrial Safety Bulletin 101C, unsanctioned manual intervention with autonomously compromised machinery is strictly prohibited. Observe from a safe distance and await specialist instruction. Risk of systemic aberration. He finally broke free from his trance, stumbling backward, tripping over a loose cable. He scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to alert the others, had to shut down the factory. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a systemic aberration, an industrial anomaly threatening to devour the entire plant. The machinery was not just compromised, it was actively hostile, infused with a grotesque life force. He ran, his heavy boots echoing on the concrete as he headed for the main switch. The factory workers, oblivious to the horror unfolding on line 3, continued their laborious tasks, their faces grim under the gaslight. He could already hear the distant faint pressure release of someone else, discovering the encroaching thermal anomaly. The air grew heavier, colder, the very foundation of the building seeming to vibrate with an unseen dread. He burst into the central control room, gasping for breath. Old man Higgins, the chief engineer, looked up from his ledgers, his spectacles perched on his nose. What in Sam Hill, Thomas? Higgins, a man of methodical precision, was rarely startled. Line 3. Thomas choked out, "It's not a jam!" It's a systemic aberration. It's consuming Foreman Davies. Higgins's expression hardened, but Thomas could see a flicker of doubt, a shadow of the old factory wives' tales that sometimes circulated amongst the men, tales of the plant being mechanically compromised. He knew Higgins had dismissed them as absurdities, as products of overworked imaginations. "Don't be daft, lad," Higgins said, though his eyes darted nervously towards the panel of gauges which were beginning to show a troubling drop in overall system pressure. "The factory is a machine. Machines break, they don't consume." But even as he spoke, a deep tremor ran through the control room, rattling the heavy brass fittings. A heavy metallic thud echoed from the depths of the factory, a sound of massive machinery being rent apart. A new sickeningly sweet stench began to filter into the control room, mixed with the acrid smell of burning insulation. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 16, 1905, instances of mass hysteria or delusions among industrial workers frequently coincide with periods of high stress and perceived environmental threat. Clinical observation indicates neurological responses mimicking trauma, even in the absence of direct physical injury. "See," Thomas urged, pointing at the shivering needles on the gauges, "it's operationally integrating the whole plant. It's an industrial anomaly." Higgins stared at the readouts, his face paling. The factory, his life's work, his carefully maintained system, was in disarray. The carefully calibrated gears, the perfectly balanced steam pressures, were all fluctuating wildly, responding to an unseen internal command. Then, a metallic groan unlike any he had ever heard before vibrated through the floor plates. Lights flickered and died in various sections of the plant, plunging them into oppressive darkness, punctuated by the remaining gas lights. The noise from the production floor was no longer the rhythmic clang of industry, but a chaotic symphony of grinding metal, splintering wood, and an unearthly liquid gurgling. Thomas looked out of the viewport, his eyes widening in horror. The vast cavernous space of the factory floor was alive with shadows. The anomaly, now vastly larger, had spread across line 3, its dark mass pulsing with a malevolent light. He saw other figures now, still figures trapped within its dark, viscous surface, their outlines eerily distinct before they dissolved into its expanding bulk. The iron residue stained the floor in grotesque patterns, reflecting the failing light. "We have to shut it down," Thomas pleaded, pointing at the massive master switch. "Before it's too late!" Higgins, however, seemed transfixed. His eyes were wide, glazed over. His lips moved, but no sound escaped. He was a man watching his world, his carefully constructed mechanical reality, crumble into an unimaginable horror. The sheer scale of the systemic dread had overwhelmed his methodical mind. Pittsburgh Press, November 11th, 1908. Engine room explosion kills 5. An unaccounted-for surge in boiler pressure led to a devastating explosion at the Blackwood manufactory early this morning. Investigations are ongoing, but early reports indicate an unprecedented equipment failure with no clear cause. A new sound began to rise from the depths of the factory, a slow, deep hum that grew in intensity, vibrating through their very bones. It was the sound of the entire plant working in concert with the anomaly, its steel sinews and iron bones becoming part of a larger, more horrifying organism. The factory was not breaking down. It was being reborn, mechanically compromised by an industrial anomaly, utterly operationally integrated. It was becoming something else entirely, something vast and grotesque. Thomas made a desperate lunge for the master switch, his fingers brushing against the cold, heavy lever. But before he could pull it, a thick, slimy tendril lashed out from the floor grate near the switch, wrapping around his wrist with surprising speed and strength. The tendril was dark and glistening, smelling faintly of the same unholy sweetness and iron residue. He cried out, a muffled pressure release as it began to constrict, pulling him towards the darkness beneath the grate. He struggled, his feet scrabbling for purchase on the smooth concrete, but the tendril was unyielding. He looked at Higgins, who stood like a still figure, his eyes wide and fixed on nothing. The systemic dread had claimed him. Thomas knew then that there was no escape, not for him, not for Higgins, and certainly not for the factory. This industrial anomaly, this terrible thing, had taken root, and it was growing. The last thing Thomas saw before the darkness enveloped him was the gaslight above flicker one final time, revealing the factory, no longer inert machinery but a vast, pulsing, mechanically compromised entity, breathing with 1,000 metallic breaths, truly operationally integrated. Its dark heart, the anomaly on line 3, throbbed with a triumphant alien rhythm, a silent testament to the terrible, systemic aberration that had devoured an entire human enterprise. The air was thick with the scent of iron residue and the chilling, pervasive cold of the encroaching thermal anomaly. The great industrial beast had awoken. The flickering gaslight cast long, dancing shadows across the factory floor, illuminating the grotesque machinery and the grim faces of the night shift. A low, guttural grinding filled the air, a constant mechanical roar that vibrated through bone and sinew. Elias, his overalls stained with years of grease and grime, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. His eyes, sunken and weary, scanned the vast cavernous space. Every cog, every piston, every chain seemed to move with a sinister intelligence, a malevolent rhythm that was slowly, inexorably devouring the men who toiled within its metallic maw. He had seen too many good men succumb to the relentless churn, their spirits broken, their bodies mangled, their minds lost to the ceaseless clangor. He remembered Thomas, strong as an ox, driven by a quiet ambition. One moment he was adjusting a valve, the next a pressure release echoed through the foundry, a sharp piercing sound that cut through the mechanical drone. They found him later, a still figure tangled in the gears, his features obscured by iron residue. The foreman, a brutish man named Mr. Abernathy, merely grunted, declaring it an unfortunate operational integration. These incidents, increasingly frequent, were meticulously documented, filed away in thick, dusty ledgers. Elias knew the truth. The factory was mechanically compromised. It absorbed men, not just their labor, but their very essence, leaving behind hollowed-out shells or worse, mangled remains. The air grew heavy, the usual metallic tang replaced by something cloying, sickening, like stale ozone and decay. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafts whistling through the broken windows. It was a pervasive cold, sinking deep into his bones, a premonition of systemic dread. He glanced at young Jimmy, barely 16, his face pale and drawn beneath the soot. Jimmy, new to the factory, still possessed a spark of youthful innocence, a light that Elias feared would soon be extinguished. "Keep your wits about you, lad," Elias muttered, his voice hoarse from years of yelling over the industrial din. "This place, it gets inside you." Jimmy merely nodded, his eyes wide, nervously darting from machine to machine. An unnerving silence, brief but profound, suddenly descended upon a section of the factory. The grinding of a massive stamping press, usually a deafening crescendo, sputtered and died. The cessation of that familiar sound was more terrifying than any noise. The men instinctively froze, their tools clattering to the concrete floor. Then from the silent press emitted a low resonant thrum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building. It was a sound that defied mechanical explanation, a living, breathing sound. This was a deviation, an industrial anomaly, manifesting in a manner that defied all engineering schematics. Mr. Abernathy, his face a mask of grim determination, strode towards the malfunctioning press, a thick wrench clutched in his hand. "What in blazes is going on here?" he bellowed, his voice echoing unnaturally in the sudden lull. As he approached, a faint shimmering thermal anomaly began to coalesce around the press, a distorting haze in the gaslight. It was indistinct, yet undeniably present, a formless presence that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The air around it grew colder, significantly dropping as if some unseen force was actively siphoning away the ambient heat. Pittsburgh Press. October 22, 1904. Industrial plant disturbance reported. Local authorities are investigating peculiar atmospheric conditions and equipment failures at the Consolidated Iron Works. 2nd Avenue. Elias remembered reading a similar report years ago, detailing inexplicable occurrences at a different plant. The anomaly intensified, its form becoming more defined, a swirling vortex of shadow and condensed vapor. A pressure release ripped through the air, high-pitched and bone-chilling. Jimmy, overcome, clutched at his ears, his body trembling violently. Elias felt his own heart pound against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of systemic dread. This was not a malfunction. It was something else, something systemically aberrant, something that had been festering within the factory's mechanical guts for years. He had heard the whispers, the hushed tales of strange occurrences, of men driven mad by the incessant drone, of unseen forces that guided the gears, that fed on the labor and the lives of the factory workers. A shudder ran through the entire building, a deep, resonant rumble that shook dust and debris from the rafters. The gaslights flickered wildly, threatening to plunge them into absolute darkness. The anomaly at the press surged, a dark, coiling shape that seemed to expand and contract, breathing in the very air of the factory. A faint, sickening smell of ozone and putrefaction filled the air, replacing the usual metallic tang. This was no ordinary breakdown. This was a profound operational failure at the most fundamental level, a terrifying manifestation of unchecked internal pressures, an accumulation of unseen forces within the factory's aging infrastructure. A low guttural moan emanated from the industrial anomaly, a sound that twisted the gut and chilled the blood. It was a sound of profound suffering, of immense power, of unimaginable age. The men scrambled back, tripping over machinery, their faces contorted in terror. Elias, despite his own fear, felt a strange sense of resignation. He had known this day would come. He had seen the signs, the subtle shifts, the increasingly violent operational integrations. Industrial Safety Memorandum 112D. All personnel are advised of the critical importance of maintaining psychological stability during periods of unusual operational stress. Cases of acute industrial hysteria have been observed to escalate existing system aberrations. Report all instances. He recalled seeing that bulletin posted near the time clock. The anomaly pulsed, and from its shadowy depths a series of clicks and whirs began to emanate. Not mechanical, but organic, like the chittering of some titanic insect. Then, impossibly, the press itself began to move, its massive arm rising and falling without human intervention, stamping nothing but empty air with a chilling, rhythmic precision. Each descent echoed like a physical blow to the chest. This was not a malfunction. It was an act of deliberate, destructive force, an engineering aberration. The atmosphere grew thick, heavy with an oppressive, unseen weight. Pittsburgh Press, March 15, 1897. Factory incident claims 2. In a shocking occurrence at the Carnegie Steel Works, 2 employees, Daniel Miller and John Rourke, perished following a machinery malfunction of unknown origin. Investigation is ongoing. Suddenly, a series of sharp, percussive sounds like heavy hammers striking metal plates in a precise, almost musical rhythm originated from within the press. It was a sickening symphony of destruction, a rhythmic beating that seemed to mirror a frantic pulse. The thermal anomaly expanded further, encompassing the entire stamping press, obscuring it behind a veil of swirling darkness. The fear among the remaining workers intensified, palpable and suffocating. Jimmy collapsed to the floor, whimpering, his hands still over his ears. Elias sought Mr. Abernathy, his face now ashen, fumbling for a lever on the wall. The emergency shut down. But even as his hand reached it, the lever itself began to glow with a faint, malevolent light, vibrating violently. It seemed to resist his touch, to actively fight against being engaged. The factory, in its terrifying display, was operationally integrated, actively rejecting any attempt to halt its horrifying progress. It was a systemically aberrant entity, a mechanical titan animated by something ancient and systemically malevolent. From the swirling darkness of the anomaly, a single skeletal hand, metallic and elongated, pushed forth, gripping the edge of the press. Its fingers articulated with unnatural precision, flexed and spasmed. This was not a human hand, nor any known machine part. It was an industrial anomaly, a biomechanical horror. The sight triggered a unified pressure release from the remaining men, a cacophony of terror that was quickly swallowed by the grinding roar of the reanimated machines. The entire factory, responding to the anomaly, seemed to awaken, gears grinding with renewed fury, steam hissing from every pipe, the air filled with the scent of hot iron and burning oil. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 7, 1899, prolonged exposure to high-decibel industrial noise and extreme operational pressures has been empirically linked to reports of acute auditory hallucinations and mass psychogenic illness among factory personnel. Further investigation into environmental factors is warranted. Elias remembered reading that article in a discarded newspaper wrapping a sandwich. He had dismissed it then, but now the words echoed with chilling resonance. This wasn't mass hysteria. This was a tangible reality. The skeletal hand pulled itself further from the anomaly, revealing an arm, then a shoulder, constructed of a bizarre amalgam of rusted steel, corroded copper, and something that glistened like polished bone. It was a chaotic yet terrifyingly functional construct, an industrial anomaly, a testament to aberrant engineering. Its head, when it finally emerged, was a nightmare of gears and levers, with two glowing red orbs for eyes that fixed upon Mr. Abernathy. The foreman, transfixed by terror, stood frozen, unable to move, unable to even utter a pressure release. The creature's gaze seemed to drain the life from him, pulling at his very essence. Abernathy's skin began to shrivel, his eyes receding into their sockets, his body slowly collapsing inward. It was a terrifying systemic consumption, a draining of vital energy, leaving him a still figure, a hushed testament to its terrifying power. The creature was not simply killing, it was integrating him, absorbing him into its mechanical, systemically aberrant form. The factory was a living, breathing being, and it was hungry. As documented in the Journal of Industrial Medicine, Volume 14, 1903, cases of rapid bioatrophy and cellular decomposition observed in highly industrialized environments require urgent pathological analysis to determine proximate causal factors, especially regarding unusual atmospheric contaminants. Elias, with a sudden surge of desperate courage born of systemic dread, grabbed Jimmy by the arm. "Run, lad, run!" he yelled, his voice barely audible above the renewed mechanical roar. He pushed the terrified boy towards a small rusty exit door, rarely used, that led to a forgotten alleyway. The creature's glowing red eyes shifted, acknowledging their attempt at escape. It was almost as if it possessed a malevolent intelligence, a calculating predatory awareness. Its skeletal hand reached out, an extension of pipes and wires clicking and whirring, grappling with the air as if trying to ensnare them. Pittsburgh Press, April 3, 1908. Unexplained disappearances at factory. Several workers from the old Mill Lane foundry have vanished without a trace in recent weeks. Police are baffled, citing no evidence of foul play in the cases of missing employees. A local inquiry board has been established, but no conclusive findings are available at this time. That report, Elias remembered, had been quickly buried. The authorities, ever eager to prioritize industrial output over human life, simply accepted the narrative of unfortunate accidents. He knew better. He knew of the operational integrations. The door rusted shut, refused to budge. Elias hammered at it furiously, his muscles screaming with effort. He could hear the creature behind them, its mechanical limbs clanking and grinding as it moved, slowly but inexorably closer. The air grew colder still, thick with the stench of iron residue and strange cloying decay. The factory, an operationally integrated entity, was consuming itself, feeding on the fear, the life, the history of its workers. It was a systemically aberrant machine, born of human industry, warped by neglect and something far older, far more terrible. The door finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal, revealing the cold, star-dusted night. Elias shoved Jimmy through, then followed, gasping for breath, the mechanical roar of the factory still echoing in his ears. He looked back just for a moment and saw the industrial anomaly, its skeletal visage illuminated by the flickering gaslights within, a terrifying sentinel poised at the edge of the abyss. It was an anomaly of pure, unadulterated raw power, a biomechanical horror. The factory behind it seemed alive, its internal mechanisms pulsating with a dark, terrible energy. Industrial Safety Memorandum, Poison G. Instances of equipment sentience or autonomous operation are to be immediately reported to supervisory personnel. All such phenomena are to be categorized as system aberrations, requiring urgent mechanical assessment and potential decommissioning. Failure to report promptly may result in disciplinary action against responsible parties. That bulletin, too, had been largely ignored, filed away as another bureaucratic formality. Elias knew that decommissioning was impossible. This factory, this monstrous, operationally integrated entity, could not be simply shut down. It was beyond human control. As Elias dragged Jimmy away from the factory, the sounds of its internal workings began to fade, replaced by the wind, yet the profound systemic dread lingered, a chilling premonition of untold horror. The factory, mechanically compromised and systemically aberrant, had swallowed other men, and it would swallow more. It was a terrifying, breathing, clicking, and grinding monument to human ambition and its monstrous consequences. A place where the lines between man and machine had blurred into a horrifying, seamless whole. And they, the workers, were merely its fuel, its iron residue,